Welcome back to another lecture, and today we're going to be talking about economic systems. So, if I had to afford you the opportunity to choose an economic system to live within, what would that system look like? Would you choose a system where you could accrue as much wealth as possible with very little limit to your spending? Or would you choose a system where there's far more equality, maybe less poverty, and everyone's viewed more equally? Which system do you think would produce the greatest amount of happiness? What do you think would be the best system? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at capitalism versus communism. We're going to look at a basic understanding of it, how to define it, a little bit of history, and some types. And so, just to have some thoughts on it, this first slide here is just to make you think. So the first one says poverty is not inevitable or natural, but it's a byproduct of capitalism. Now, that may or may not be true, but that's something I want you to think about and have an answer for by the end of this small lecture. And the next one is with capitalism, you either work or you starve, and with communism, you work and starve. So it's really a bit of a way up that you need to make, in terms of what sort of economic system you would love to live within. So let's look at capitalism versus communism in terms of what they are and what they mean. And this is going to be starting from a very, very basic level so that we can all get an understanding of what these terms are. It's very common that these terms are thrown around in debating without a proper understanding of why they came about or what they exactly mean. People often assume that capitalism just means more money and communism just means equality, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So let's look at the meaning first, right? So capitalism, by definition, is an economic system promoting private entity ownership of the means of production, and it favors the free market. Communism is a political and economic ideology promoting economic equality and disapproving private property concept, and therefore it opposes capitalism, right? It came up in opposition to capitalism. The goal of capitalism is to make and maximize profit using democracy generally and the free market, and the goal of communism is to follow a planned economy and establish a communist society. The means of production in capitalism are owned by private entities, and in communism, it's owned by the government. We'll get into an understanding of what that exactly means a little bit later on. In terms of government intervention, there's minimal or no government intervention in capitalism, and in communism, there's high government intervention and it's more of a command economy. Although there is some nuance to this, which we'll get into later. In terms of the essential characteristics, and these are the things that you mainly need to remember when you think of the words capitalism and communism. Capitalism has private ownership, profit motive, minimal government intervention, a competitive market, capital accumulation, and class systems are created involuntarily. And for communism, think common or public ownership, central planning, much less competition, and a classless society, which is what they would ideally aim for. And then in terms of pricing, which is a slight look into economics, in capitalism, pricing is usually set via supply and demand, and in communism, it's controlled by the government. So let's look at some pros and cons through the lens of capitalism, right? So what is good about capitalism? What is bad about capitalism? And then the converse would obviously apply for communism. So the benefit of a capitalist system, which we just described, is that there's a lot of freedom for the producers and consumers. There's open competition between businesses. There's incentives for innovation to create new ideas and new things and sell them to make more profit. And there's natural price stabilization in most instances. That means that the supply and demand affects the price such that it doesn't become a situation where there's too much of an excessive price or too low of a price, right? It usually balances itself out. And some major disadvantages is that there's high rates of income inequality, and this is what we know and what we see in the current day. There's the formation of monopolies where a certain group of people accrue a lot of wealth and are then able to dictate and control power in an area. And very commonly, there's exploitation of workers because there's such a gap between the rich and the poor need to survive because of the capitalist system, so they're willing to work for very low wages, for example, right? So it's and we have all heard of these pros and cons of capitalism. So now back to what I was talking about in terms of the means of production, right? What does that mean, right? So the means of production are the elements needed to produce goods and services. For example, land, labor, and capital. And any production process depends upon a particular material configuration of the means of production. This means look at any object around you, the table that's in front of you, the chair that you're sitting on. It required different things to be produced, right? It required land, it required people being willing to make it, it required capital to buy the machinery, to buy the raw materials. That's basically what the means of production means, right? It's the factors that contributed to a product being produced. And there was a guy named Karl Marx, very famous, who believed capitalism to be characterized by a split, right, between two groups. So there's between the capitalist owners, also known as the bourgeoisie, and these people owned the means of production. And he believed that there were also people called the proletarians who only had their labor to sell. They weren't able to own the means of production. So that's how Karl Marx viewed it, right? He viewed the split and he didn't like the fact that the split existed. And communism is the official form of government in China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. However, these countries also abide by some capitalist principles, and they are largely autocratic in nature, and they don't reflect Marx's definition of what true communism was, right? We don't really see an example of that in the modern day. Okay, so let's look at communism explored a bit further. So now we're going to go into some history and background on communism. So firstly, to understand, modern communist ideology began to develop during the French Revolution and its seminal tract, where Karl Marx and this guy Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, which can be seen on the right? And that pamphlet rejected the Christian tenor of previous communist philosophies, laying out a materialist and scientific analysis of the history and the future trajectory of human society. So basically, these guys wrote this thing saying, right, we want society to look this way via a communist perspective, right? Basically, you can go and read this if you want to, but you don't need to know too much detail about it, right? But the important thing is that in communist theory, the final stage of human development would mark the end of all class struggles and therefore of history. So what they would want to occur is all people would live in social equilibrium without class distinctions, family structures, religion, or property. And the state too would wither away, right? So that's the ideal thing that they wanted. Okay, so we're going to look at two examples of communism. The first is the Soviet Union and the second is China in modern day, right? So let's look at the Soviet Union, which obviously no longer exists as we know. So what happened, right? In 1917, during World War I, there was an uprising in Russia, which toppled the Tsar, which is the ruler of Russia. And this sparked a civil war, and there was a group of radical Marxists led by Vladimir Lenin, right, which gained power. This group was called the Bolsheviks, and they founded the Soviet Union. And they attempted to put communism into practice. And it actually worked, right? It worked at that point in time, right? The Soviet state became very powerful. They prohibited dissent. They controlled the economy, agriculture, the banking system, industrial production was subject to quotas and price controls. All of this was laid out by this Soviet government, right? You can read up more on that. And this system of central planning, so central planning means the central body, such as the government, controls a lot of what is going on in the economy, meaning they're able to set prices for certain goods. They're able to decide what goods are available for buying, selling, etc. That sort of stuff, right? So most things economically were planned by the government in a central body. So central planning was working quite well initially, right? And it allowed for rapid industrialization, right? A large spike in the GDP. And it even outpaced that of the US at that time, right? And however, though, the Soviet economy grew at a much slower pace than its capitalist or democratic counterparts, right? And weak consumer spending was a particular drag on growth. What happened was central planners had a heavy emphasis on industry. And this led to the chronic underproduction of consumer goods. And there were long lines at understocked grocery stores. And there was a lot of poverty and problems that came about, right? So even though there was this great prosperity in terms of the overall nation as a whole, with the GDP, etc., because of the amount that the country was producing, for example, there was a bit of problems that resurfaced on the ground level, with people not being able to get basic needs or necessities or goods. Okay, and as a result of that, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But you can read more on that. And an example too would be China. So what happened was, in 1949, after more than 20 years of war with the Chinese Nationalist Party and Imperial Japan, Mao Zedong's Communist Party gained control of China to form the world's second major Marxist-Leninist state, right? So Mao's rule in China resembled Stalin's in its violence, deprivation, and insistence on ideological purity. And what happened during this thing called the Great Leap Forward, the Communist Party ordered the rural population to produce enormous quantities of steel in an effort to jumpstart the Industrial Revolution in China. And that seemed good, right? It seemed quite good, but in that same period of time, there was this great Chinese famine, right, that killed at least 16 million people and perhaps more than 45 million. So what you can see in the similarity is that there was such a heavy emphasis on industry and producing and trying to be industrialized that they almost forgot about the basic needs of the people on the ground level, right? And in this case, it led to the severe famine that occurred in China. So that was the issue with the central planning, that it just went wrong. And then afterwards, there was a series of market reforms that remained in effect, and the US began normalizing relations with China when President Nixon visited. And now the Chinese Communist Party was created, right? And that's still in power, and that presides over a largely capitalist system through state-owned enterprises, which continue to form a large part of the economy. However, freedom of expression is significantly curtailed, and meaningful opposition to the CCP isn't permitted, right? So it'll take a miracle for the CCP to be ousted, right? But that's currently what's occurring in China. So my question then is, why did communism fail, right? Because in the instances where it's been tried to be applied fully, it's failed, right? It hasn't worked as effectively as people would have liked it to, right? Or as effectively as its capitalist counterpart. So why is that? So there's a few reasons. Number one, or theories rather. Number one is that there's a lack of profit incentive among citizens, and that leads to less competition and less innovation. If you don't have to create something to put food on the table or stand out in your industry, then there's no need for you to innovate. There's no need for you to create new goods and services and products if everything's already given to you, or if at least there's a plan for everything to be already given to you. Secondly, there was a failure of central planning, as I previously described, right? And the issue is that central planning is often complex. It requires lots of data, and growth data may have been fabricated to create an illusion of progress. So that is the data of how well the country is doing, right, in the view of the global sphere, and that may have been fabricated to make it seem like the country is progressing, but realistically, they're only progressing in certain areas and not as well as they would have liked to. Thirdly, and I think the main problem, was the concentration of power, which led to exploitation of the system, corruption, laziness. What this means is that there were certain people who gained control of everything. Generally, they were involved in central planning, and then they skewed the economy in certain ways because they had so much power, and that created problems. And the fourth theory, which is just something that I personally believe, is human nature. Right? I feel like humans inherently are greedy and they want things for themselves. I feel like humans are always going to want to get more if it is possible for them to get more. So I think it's quite hard for then people who do have that background to exist within a communist system where they aren't always allowed to get more or do things freely. I feel like people are always going to want to do that, and that's evidenced by how people act within a capitalist system. So yeah, these are just some of the reasons as to why you think communism failed. So now let's look at capitalism a bit more in depth, right? So capitalism explored further. So this guy on the right, Adam Smith, who was a philosopher and also considered one of the fathers of modern economics. So what he said is that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So you can see he's being a bit more realistic in terms of understanding human nature. He says that both parties to a voluntary exchange or voluntary transaction have their own interest in the outcome, but neither can obtain what he or she wants without addressing what the other wants. And it is this rational self-interest that can lead to economic prosperity. What that means basically is that, see, let's look at a butcher, for example, right? You go to the butcher. The butcher is not giving you meat because he wants to give you meat or because he likes giving you meat. The butcher is giving you meat because you're going to give him money in return for that. And that money is something that he can use to sustain himself, right? So he is self-interested in wanting money. You are self-interested in wanting meat because you want food for the day, for example, right? So both parties are self-interested, but in that way, it sort of works, so that's what he's saying. And looking at some other aspects of capitalism now is when property isn't privately owned, but rather is shared by the public, a problem known as the tragedy of the commons can emerge, right? So what happens then? This is looking at what would happen in communism ideally, right? So with a common pool resource then, which all people can use and none can limit access to, sorry, this is in capitalism, that none can limit access to, all individuals have an incentive to extract as much use value as they can and no incentive to conserve or reinvest in the resource. And privatization is a possible solution to that. So what that means is that if things are so freely available to you, such as in a capitalist system, the problem is that people will take and take and take from that resource without having an incentive to reinvest in that resource. And that is a problem because that is unsustainable. And that's what we see in capitalism. And also, under capitalist production, the business owners retain ownership of the goods being produced, which is quite crazy to think about because if a worker in a shoe factory were to take home a pair of shoes that they made with their own hands, it would be theft, right? And this concept is known as alienation of workers from their labor. So even though that worker produced those shoes, that pair of shoes, by their own hands, that pair of shoes is not theirs and they have no claim to it. They alienated from their labor. And that's what capitalism does. Right, so we're going to look at some types of capitalism. There's 6 that we're going to go through. So the first one is known as oligarchic capitalism. So what this means is that there's a small group of elite capitalists called oligarchs who have taken control of the economic and the political system. And what they do, as you can imagine, this is bad because they use existing wealth to buy off competitors or corrupt politicians. Examples include modern-day Russia and Ukraine. The reason this is an example is because the end of the Soviet communism in that area allowed small groups to capture key parts of the economy, the oligarchs. And then some may argue that the USA is sliding towards oligarchy, with large corporations such as Amazon and Walmart having lots of power in the economy. The next type is state-guided capitalism. So here you can see the government does have control, right? And this may remind you of parts of communism, but it's a form of capitalism, right? It's state guided. So the economy is mostly guided by the state through regulations and direct economic activities. So regulations are rules for private actors in the economy to follow. For example, environmental regulations, which are meant to prevent damage to the environment by setting minimum standards on pollution and other issues. And also direct economic activities through state-owned firms and government agencies that manage economic production. And most countries use a form of state-guided capitalism, meaning the state does intervene here and there, not fully, but they are present, right? And the most extreme example of this, however, is China, where the Chinese government owns firms that account for approximately 40% of the economy, which is very, very high. We then get corporate capitalism. So big companies have a controlling position on the market achieved through neoliberal policies. And there's similarities between oligarchic and corporate capitalism. Remember the first one. In both cases, both those with an advantage on the market due to their size will try to use their position to create even further advantages, right? And we refer to this as anti-competitive behavior. And corporate capitalism is therefore not a truly free market system. When we say free market, we mean a situation where everyone is able to trade freely on that market from an equal position, right? And that's also idealistic in a way, right? I think it's very rare for that to actually occur. So what we're saying in corporate capitalism is that there's instead of a group of wealthy people or a government or so, it is the corporations that then are able to take control of a lot of the economy. They are efficient, but they create monopolies. And in a situation where the corporations allude with the government or collude with the government, we can get something called crony capitalism. Right. An example of this is Facebook or Meta, which we know dominates social media through its ownership of WhatsApp and Instagram. Right. It's a corporation that dominates. And more examples are Toyota or Samsung, who operate in a wide range of industries, right? Beyond just car manufacturing or phone manufacturing, right? The next example is entrepreneurial capitalism. So, as you can imagine by the definition of the word, this is based on the work of free market entrepreneurs, right? And it won't have the same efficiency as large scale corporate capitalism. This can be regarded as the purest form of capitalism. However, entrepreneurial capitalism can be hard to maintain, as inevitably some entrepreneurs will be more successful than others, and then they'll expand by buying off their competition. This leads to even bigger businesses until corporate capitalism is reached. So therefore, this whole entrepreneurial capitalism doesn't last very long. So you can imagine it's basically saying that this allows a lot of people to create their own businesses, have your startups and whatever, and then eventually these get bigger, they buy off competition, and it leads to corporate capitalism. So there's definitely elements of entrepreneurial capitalism that we see around us. However, it'll never be the sole focus, or the major focus of the capitalist system. The next one, which is quite commonly heard of, is called laissez-faire capitalism, right? So laissez-faire, which is the French word for let do, basically means let people do as much as they want with minimal interference from the state, right? It's the complete absence of state intervention in the market. So ideally what this means is that the government takes a step back and they're like, right, let the market do what it wants to do. We are not going to intervene. We are not going to set things. We're going to try and not have state-owned enterprises in the market. Let it do its own thing, right? And let's see what happens. And there is a paradox that's created in laissez-faire capitalism, in that the opposition to government intervention, in the hopes of maintaining the competitive free market, will eventually create the need for government intervention in order to preserve competitiveness within the market, right? So if it's so free, there may be situations where people don't have a need to compete with each other. And then, as we've discussed earlier, if there's people not competing with each other, it's probably less efficient, right? Which was a drawback of communism, as we remember. So the government may then need to intervene to create competitiveness by maybe inserting a state-owned enterprise or something of that nature. The sixth type is welfare state capitalism. So what happens here is the government plays a major role in welfare state capitalism. And unlike in state-guided capitalism, welfare state capitalism is based on using the state to redistribute some of the resources of the economy. What happens here is that the competitive private market continues to operate, but taxation is used to provide for people who have not succeeded within the market. These resources include money, with people receiving unemployment benefits, support for raising children, and however, it may include direct provision of services such as healthcare and education, right? So it reminds me of South Africa in a way. And proper examples are Sweden, Norway, and Finland. When a welfare state is very well controlled and very well regulated, it works better than any other form, in my opinion, of capitalism. Right? This is my favorite kind of economic system, because if you see the way these Norway, Finland, Sweden, etc. operate, it is incredibly efficient, right? The standard of education, the standard of healthcare, all of that is incredibly high. So there are some real benefits to welfare state capitalism that exists within a setting of having good resources and having good policies. So it does work out quite well in that instance. So yeah. And of course, it is important to recognize that capitalism is all around us, right? It's everywhere. We are often we exist within a capitalist system, and whether we're being persuaded by the media we consume, the music, the on TV, other people, no matter what we do, we can't escape this capitalist system. And for those who have won the race of capitalism, such as maybe Lil Wayne or Rick Ross, it's very what they then do is they persuade others to continue the race, right? Because it is a rat race. That is essentially what it is. And all we do is we look to the winners of the rat race, and then we want to be them. And then once we eventually get there, we look down on the people below us and we try to encourage them to get to the top as well. It's very hard to remove yourself from the system. We're always encouraged to get money and do this and do that, and prosper. And sadly, it is the only way to survive, I suppose. So it is a shame that that is the way the world has become. But it's almost silly now to want to exist as a communist within a current capitalist state, because then it's doing nothing for you. So there's a lot of people that I see that still hold communist beliefs, that they want to be communist, etc. They believe in equality and all of that. And all of that's good and okay, but that's not going to do anything for you in the current system. So yeah, it's the point of this is just to say that, you know what, capitalism is everywhere, and it's something we, whether you like it or not, it's something we have to subscribe to because we don't have an option. So that's what it is currently. And of course, I had to put in a little critique of capitalism as well. My team for KZN has we've changed our name to Pimp a Butterfly, which is an album by Kendrick Lamar for those of you who don't know, and I think that's an appropriate name, you know. So I had to find a little bit of a song there to link, just to link something, you know. So this song is called Wesley's Theory. It's by Kendrick Lamar, and you should listen to it if you do get the opportunity. But what Kendrick does is a very interesting critique of capitalism, right? So what I've taken here is I've highlighted a few lyrics that I think are worth pointing out, you know. So on the yellow highlights, what Kendrick does is he shows the pull of capitalism, or he shows the attractiveness of it, you know, by saying what you want, you know, a house, a car, 40 acres, a mule, a piano, a guitar. Look at all of these things, right? So too much ain't enough, both we know, get it all, you deserve it. All of this are the pull of capitalism, the narratives that exist making us believe that capitalism is what we need, it's what we want, we can get what we want. If we just work a bit harder, we're able to get whatever, you know. And then in the green highlighting, what he does highlight is that despite the pull of capitalism, there's always going to be drawbacks, such as taxation, right? So everything you buy, taxes will deny. Or he also speaks about the fact that the American government, no matter what, is going to crack down on you. You know, that's what the last line refers to. It's going to crack down on you regardless. So what he's saying is that capitalism has all this pull and this freedom and this nice life that it paints, but when it does that and when it draws you in, it doesn't tell you about the drawbacks of it, you know. It's only when you are too far in and too far immersed in it that you start to see the problem with being stuck in the system. And by then, it's probably too late. You just have to exist within it. So I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. You know, there's possibilities to there's obviously pros to it as well. You know, but I suppose that's just the way it is. You know, it's up for interpretation. Okay, so what should you know at this point? So you should have an idea of what capitalism is and what communism is. You should be able to define it. That table from the first few slides is quite important. So that gives you a good idea. You should know some of the pros and cons of them. You should be able to have an understanding of the history behind communism and capitalism. And that's useful in debating, especially if you find yourself arguing from the point of communism or capitalism. It's useful to have a historical background for it, you know, to provide context. And then I hope you also understand some of the types and modern day application of capitalism, you know, where we can see it. And that is generally where a lot of debates do happen currently. You know, we get a lot of debates about welfare states and welfare and, you know, um, businesses and entrepreneurship, all of that, right? So that becomes very relevant then. So it's useful to have an understanding of the context of where those are used in order to apply it best. Here is some references, but you can do more reading. Okay, and thank you very much. That concludes this lecture on capitalism versus communism. Hopefully you've learned something, and I'll catch you in the next one.